The morning mist still clung to the iron railings outside Kensington Palace when James Whitmore arrived for his shift. He had done this walk hundreds of times, through the side gate near the service entrance, past the neatly trimmed hedgerows that separated the working world of palace staff from the manicured public gardens beyond. His boots made the same sound on the same stones. His uniform, pressed the night before by his own hands, sat stiff and perfect across his broad shoulders. For James, routine was not just comfort. It was purpose. It was the invisible wall he had built around himself since leaving the army, since losing friends in places that still visited him in dreams. The palace was order, the palace was certainty, and James Whitmore was very good at certainty. He had served as a royal protection officer for 11 years. Before that, 12 years in the British Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. He had stood beside royals at state dinners and charity galas, had walked behind them through markets in West Africa and beside motorcades in Washington. He had trained for every contingency, had rehearsed responses to threats that most people could not even imagine. He knew the protocols, the escalation procedures, the quiet language of earpieces and hand signals. He was, by every professional measure, unshakable. And then came the Tuesday morning that changed everything. It did not arrive with fanfare. It came instead in the form of a small girl in a pale blue nightgown standing at the top of a staircase, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes wide and red from crying. James had been positioned near the main hallway, an unusual placement that morning, owing to a temporary adjustment in patrol routes while a section of the East Corridor was being assessed by building staff. He was not supposed to be there. Not really. He was supposed to be outside doing his regular sweep of the West Garden perimeter. But the adjustment had put him indoors, near the base of the grand staircase, at exactly the moment that Princess Charlotte appeared at the top of it. She was 7 years old at the time. James had seen her before, of course, in passing, at a distance, the way palace staff see royals. You learn to look without staring, to acknowledge without intruding. You learn to be present and invisible at the same time. He had watched her once playing with her younger brother in the garden, and the two of them chasing after a ball with the complete abandonment that only children manage. She had laughed so hard that day that the sound of it had cut right through his professional detachment and made him smile before he could stop himself. But this morning she was not laughing. This morning she was standing very still at the top of the stairs, her hands gripping the banister rail, knuckles white, her small face creased with the particular distress of a child who does not know how to hold the weight of something too big for her. She was looking directly at James. For a long moment, neither of them moved. James was acutely aware of the protocols. You do not initiate contact with members of the royal family. You are present for their protection, not their interaction. You remain professional, unobtrusive, respectful of the invisible boundary that separates service from familiarity. These were not merely rules to him. They were the architecture of his working life. But Charlotte did not seem to know or care about protocols that morning. She took one careful step down the staircase, then another, her bare feet silent on the carpet runner, her hand still trailing along the banister. When she reached the bottom step, she stopped. She was close enough now that James could see her eyes clearly, pale blue, like her nightgown, and swimming with the kind of tears that have been held in for some time. She looked up at him for a moment without speaking. James stood at attention, unsure, his training offering him no script for this particular moment. And then she said, very quietly, "Please, I need help." "Something is wrong with Mummy." The words hit him in the chest like a physical thing. In 11 years of service, James Whitmore had never heard anything quite like it, not because the sentence was complex. It was, in fact, devastatingly simple, but because it carried in it a child's complete and absolute trust. She had not gone to a lady-in-waiting. She had not gone to the household staff or to one of the women she saw every morning at breakfast. She had come to him, a man in a uniform she barely knew, because in that moment of terror, he had been the first person she found. And children, in moments of real fear, reach for whoever is nearest. James felt something shift inside him, not his training. That remained intact, already running through possibilities, protocols, who to contact, and how fast. But beneath that layer of professionalism, something older and quieter stirred. The part of him that had held injured comrades in foreign dust. The part that had once, a long time ago and in another life entirely, promised himself that he would never stand still when someone needed help. "Tell me what happened," he said. His voice came out steadier than he felt, which he was grateful for. Charlotte's chin trembled. "She was sick in the night," she said. "I heard her. And now she won't wake up properly, and she's very hot, and her eyes look wrong, and I didn't know who to get." She paused and then added with a terrible small dignity, "I thought you could help because you look like you know things." James had already pressed his earpiece and was speaking before she finished. His training took over cleanly, the way it always did in genuine emergencies, not with panic, but with a strange, focused calm that had been hammered into him over years of preparation. He reported the situation using the coded language of palace security, requested immediate medical attendance, and gave his location. His supervisor responded within seconds. The call went up the chain. The whole machine moved, but Charlotte did not know any of this. All she saw was a large man in a dark uniform pressing something in his ear and speaking in a low, rapid voice. Her lower lip began to wobble. James looked down at her and made a decision that was not in any manual he had ever read. He crouched down so that he was at her eye level. In the cold morning light of the palace hallway, with the weight of protocol pressing down on him from every professional direction, he looked directly at the little girl and said, "I've called for help. The right people are coming right now. Your mummy is going to be seen to very quickly. You did exactly the right thing by finding someone." Charlotte stared at him. The tears that had been balanced on the edge of her eyes finally gave way, sliding silently down her cheeks in two thin lines. "Is she going to be all right?" she asked. James paused. He was an honest man. He had served in places where dishonesty about outcomes had caused more pain than the truth ever could. He did not make promises he could not keep. But he was also crouched in front of a 7-year-old who had just walked down a staircase alone in the dark because she was frightened for her mother, and he understood that this moment required a particular kind of courage. Not the courage of knowing, but the courage of steadiness. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I can tell you that the people who are coming are very good at their jobs, and they are coming fast. Right now, the best thing you've done for your mummy is exactly what you did. You asked for help." Something in the girl's face shifted. Not relief exactly, but a small easing like a door opening a crack to let in light. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She nodded once, slowly, as if processing something very large through a very small opening. Then she said something that James Whitmore would carry with him for the rest of his life, something he would retell quietly and only to people he truly trusted years later, long after this morning had faded from the palace's institutional memory and become something only he knew fully. She looked at him very seriously, and the way that only children can when they have made up their minds about something important, and she said, "I was scared to ask. I thought maybe I wasn't supposed to bother you. Are guards allowed to be bothered?" James was quiet for a moment. Around them, the palace was beginning to stir. He could hear footsteps now from further down the corridor, the medical team arriving, voices through his earpiece confirming that the situation was being handled. In 60 seconds, the hallway would be full of professional people doing professional things, and this small, private moment would be over. "Yes," he said, and he meant it with more weight than a single word usually carries. That's exactly what we're here for. Charlotte looked at him for another second, then gave a brief, solemn nod, so oddly adult that it caught at something in his throat. Then the footsteps arrived, and a familiar lady-in-waiting swept in and gathered Charlotte gently by the shoulder, and the morning machine took over. James stood back up to his full height. He returned to his position. He resumed the professional stillness that was his job. But his hands, for just a moment before they stilled, were not quite steady. Later that day, when the crisis had passed, when the medical team had confirmed that Princess Catherine was suffering from a severe respiratory infection that had come on rapidly in the night, serious but treatable, and was already improving under medical care, James filed his incident report with the precision and economy of language that palace service required. He noted the time, the location, the nature of the medical call, the response timeline. And he did not write about crouching down in the hallway. He did not write about the question a 7-year-old had asked him, or about what it had done to him. Those things did not belong in an incident report. They belonged somewhere else, in the complicated interior country of a man who had spent his adult life being professionally unmoved, and who was learning, slowly and sometimes against his will, that being moved was not the same as being undone. His supervisor called him in at the end of the shift. There was a quiet commendation for his quick response time, his adherence to protocol, his effective management of the situation. James received it with the same stillness he gave everything. He said thank you. He shook the offered hand. Walking out through the side gate that evening, past the same iron railings, that through the same pale evening light, James Whitmore did not feel like a man who had done his job well. He felt like a man who had been handed something without fully understanding its weight yet. Something that did not belong in any protocol or procedure manual. Something that lived in the space between duty and humanity that he had always thought were two different things. He was beginning to suspect they were not. The city moved around him as he walked to the underground station. People with headphones and briefcases, with coffees and preoccupied eyes. The ordinary world turning on its ordinary axis. James moved through it quietly, the way he always did, and thought about a small girl at the top of a staircase, gripping the banister in the dark, deciding whether or not it was allowed to ask for help. He thought about what it had cost her to take those steps down, and he thought about what it said, about her, and about something in himself that he had not expected to find this morning, that she had taken them anyway. The week that followed the incident passed with the quiet efficiency that palace life required. Catherine's condition improved steadily, as the doctors had predicted it would. The respiratory infection, while frightening in its sudden onset, responded well to treatment. Within 3 days, she was sitting up and receiving short visits from her children. Within a week, she was walking the garden corridor in the mornings, still pale, still carefully tended, but recognizably herself, upright, composed, her eyes carrying their usual thoughtful warmth. James heard about her recovery through the careful second-hand language of palace communication, a supervisor's brief update, the visible change in household atmosphere, which shifts like weather when something worrying resolves. He did not expect to hear more than that, and he did not. His brief, strange encounter in the hallway had served its purpose. It had set the right wheels turning at the right moment, and that was the whole of it. He had told himself this convincingly for 6 days. On the 7th, he was stationed at his usual post near the East Garden entrance when a member of the household staff approached him. A young woman named Isabel, whose job kept her moving between the family's private quarters and the administrative wing. She had a particular kind of careful formality when she delivered messages, and he recognized it now as she came toward him across the gravel path. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. I've been asked to let you know that Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales wishes to thank you personally for your response last Tuesday. She's suggested Thursday morning, if that's convenient." There was a brief pause, and then Isabel added with a slightly less official inflection. She was quite specific about it being a personal thanks rather than a formal one. James absorbed this without visible reaction, which was one of his considerable skills. "Thursday morning is fine," he said. "I'll be available." Isabel nodded and departed with the brisk purposefulness of someone who has many such messages to carry. James returned his attention to the garden and thought carefully about nothing in particular for the rest of his shift. And Thursday morning came gray and cool, with the kind of thin autumn light that makes everything look slightly formal. James had spent an unreasonable amount of time the previous evening thinking about the meeting and then telling himself there was nothing to think about. He had done his job. He had responded correctly. He would be thanked, which was a routine thing, and that would be the end of it. He was led through a side corridor by a member of the private household staff and left in a sitting room that was smaller and more lived in than the staterooms visitors sometimes glimpsed in photographs. There were books stacked on a side table, a child's drawing tacked slightly crookedly to a corkboard near the window, a pair of small, muddy boots by the door that someone had clearly been meaning to move for some time. The room had the particular texture of a place that was actually used, not curated, not arranged for observation, but just inhabited. Catherine came in a few minutes after James arrived. She was dressed simply, her hair pulled back, and while there was still a careful quality to how she moved, a slight economy of energy that spoke to recent illness, her eyes were fully present and clear. She thanked the staff member who had shown her in and closed the door gently before turning to James. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was composed but warm, the kind of tone James had heard her use in public, though in person it had a quieter quality, more direct. "And thank you, much more than I can properly say, for what you did last week." James opened his mouth to offer the standard response. It was my job, and I was glad to help. But something in the directness of her gaze stopped him from reaching for the comfortable formula. "I'm glad I was there," he said instead. It was simpler. It was also true. "Charlotte told me about you," Catherine said, and she said it with a particular care that indicated she had been thinking about how to say it. "She told me that when she came to find you, she was afraid that she wasn't supposed to bother a guard, that guards were for important things." A brief pause. "And that you told her that was exactly what you were there for." James said nothing. He was not sure there was anything useful to add. "She has talked about it quite a bit," Catherine continued. "The way children do when something has properly settled in them." She looked at him steadily. "I wanted you to know that what you said to her, not just the practical things, calling for help, handling it efficiently, but the way you spoke to her. It mattered to her. She was 7 years old, and she walked down those stairs alone in the dark because she was frightened for me. And what she found at the bottom was someone who made her feel that asking for help was the right and reasonable thing to do, that it wasn't an imposition, that she was allowed." She paused again, and James noticed, with a professional detachment that was not entirely holding, that her voice had become slightly less smooth. "That's not a small thing. For a child to learn that asking for help is allowed." James stood very still in the way that he did when something was moving him that he had not prepared for. And he thought about the incident report he had written, clean and concise and containing none of this. He thought about Charlotte at the top of the stairs, her knuckles white on the banister. He thought about what it costs a child, what it costs anyone, to decide that they are worth the asking. "She was very brave," he said at last. It came out with more weight than he had intended, which happened sometimes when he let things through the professional distance. Something in Catherine's expression acknowledged this. She was, she agreed. She is often. But she needed to know that the bravery was worth something, that someone on the other side would receive it properly. She paused. You did. There was a brief silence between them that was not uncomfortable. Not the kind that settles when something true has been said, and both people in the room know it. James thought of the things he had carried out of the army, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the reflexive cataloging of exits whenever he entered a room, the particular difficulty of being still when stillness felt like exposure. He thought of the years of palace service that had given him purpose and structure, that had let him keep the useful parts of who he had become and manage the harder ones. He had never been a man who spoke easily about any of this, and he did not speak about it now. But he felt it, quietly, in the room. She asked me something, he said after a moment. He was not sure why he said it. It was not planned. When the help was already coming. She asked if guards were allowed to be bothered. Catherine's expression shifted, and James saw something move through it. A parent's particular pain at learning what her child had carried alone, combined with something fiercer and more private. What did you tell her? She asked. That it was exactly what we were there for. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'll make sure she knows you mean it, that it applies beyond guards. She said it gently, but with a firmness that was clearly a lifelong project and not a small one. James nodded. He understood in the way that people sometimes understand things that belong to other people's lives and stories, that what had happened in that hallway was not only about a child's fear for her mother, it was about the architecture of how that child would move through the world, whether she would learn to reach for help or to manage alone in the dark, whether the people around her, in whatever uniforms or roles, would receive her need or deflect it, whether asking would cost her something or give her something back. He had not thought about any of this when he crouched down in the hallway. He had only thought about steadying a frightened child. But the things we do without thinking are sometimes the things that matter most. When the meeting ended, briefly, warmly, with the grace that Catherine brought to all such moments, James was led back to the corridor and then to his post, and the palace day resumed around him with its usual crisp efficiency. And he stood at his position near the east garden gate and watched the morning light move across the gravel paths. A gardener worked at a hedge in the far corner. A pair of staff members crossed between buildings carrying folders. Everything was ordinary. Everything was as it should be. James Whitmore did not think of himself as a man who changed things. He was a man who held positions, who responded to threats, who maintained order. He was the architecture that other people lived their lives inside. That was the job. That was what he was good at. But standing there in the thin autumn light, he thought about a small girl taking careful steps down a dark staircase. He thought about the moment when she had made up her mind to ask. He thought about what it takes, for any person of any age, and in any circumstances, to decide that their fear is worth bringing to another human being, that the asking will not be punished, that help is something they are allowed to receive. He thought, maybe that is also a kind of order, the kind that matters most. And then a car came through the gate, and he straightened and resumed his surveillance, and the morning went on, as mornings do, holding everything it had given him and asking for nothing back.